Alrighty, we're gonna let people load on in first, and then I'll give the spiel and you can get started. We should have about three people, so they're probably just doing the nice pizzazz. I see one, two, and
Trace.
no, no three yet.
No, no trace.
No. Three. There we go. We got the three people.
All right.
Alrighty. Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation here today. My name's Roberto, and I'm the moderator on staff. However, I am not working for Zoom because otherwise I'd be very mad at them today. Um, but if you have any issues, please feel free to write it in the chat and I'll assist as much as possible. I will be muted and video off for most of the session, but watching the chat in general. So in today's presentation, we will have about 20 minutes of content and then 20 minutes for a Q&A. And then from there, Ethan can decide to go as far over as possible as long as he doesn't go over 40 minutes. But then let's introduce our speaker today. So here we have Ethan Johnson, an amateur professional gaming historian who has been deep diving on video games for almost 10 years. He's written for the YouTube channel Gaming Historian. He's a chief editor of game preservation site Gaming Alexandria and appears as a guest on history podcasts like Video Game Newsroom, Time Machine, and Industrial Revolutions. He's animated about interaction, technology, and the crazy world of media. So give it up for Ethan Johnson of Play History. Clap, 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 clap. And I
Hey,
hear, and I actually,
welcome everybody.
I do hear the thunderous applause in the background too.
All right, thank you, thank you. So yes, my name is Ethan. I run Play History, which is not a podcast. I'm here on a technicality, which I will get to later. But I do have YouTube videos and make various appearances around the web. Today, we are going to be talking about a subject which overwhelms much of video game history discourse, Atari. And did Atari pull off the heist of the century? And throughout this talk, you can feel free to put your comments, your questions in the chat, and we will be getting to them at the end. So I'm not going to pretend that everybody in here knows or loves Atari. Like I've seen the audience now, and I know that it's just barely within living memory for some people. But in terms of their cultural impact and their shadow over video game history, it's just enormous. And what really made them both wealthy and culturally relevant was the video computer system. This, you may know it better as the Atari 2600. I'm going to call it the VCS. That was the name through much of its early lifespan, which is really what we're going to be talking about here. It sold tens of millions of consoles and over 100 million cartridges from its release in 1977 to its discontinuation in 1992. Yes, once upon a time, consoles could last over a decade. It established the parameters of the home console market and made Atari Incorporated, the original Atari, the Atari that exists today, unrelated, too long of a story to get into right now, but it made them a $2 billion company in 1982. Until the crash, but we're not going to talk about that part. But supposedly during the development of the VCS, they nearly lost the technology due to a lawsuit, and they had to trick their opposition into the idea that this didn't even exist. So, what's the truth behind this widely reported, in my circles story? Let's talk some background first. Atari first got into the home video game market with a version of their arcade game Pong, and it was a big deal. They weren't the first, second, or even dozenth company to make a home console, but they changed the conversation about the market and what levels of success it could reach. The first people who did get into this business were Magnavox with their Odyssey console, and it had released to fairly modest success. It didn't really seem like they were going to be a big player, and part of it was that they were, even when they launched, kind of behind the times. The original technology that was in the Odyssey was developed in 1966. And the three principal inventors of the technology behind the Odyssey are left to right here Ralph Baer, William Rush, and William Harrison. And they worked for a defense contractor named Sanders Associates. And in the process of making this video game system, they had filed several technologies on, or several patents on the technology. which became the Odyssey in 1992. Also in 1992, Atari releases their first game, Pong. Magnavox had a bit of a claim on this, and they were aware of Pong from very early on. They tried to negotiate with Atari along with a bunch of other video game companies who were releasing clones of Pong to try and get licensing royalties from them for their patents. Now, something I gotta make clear, if you've looked this up on the internet before, Magnavox did not patent the idea of a video game. You couldn't do that. You have to patent specific methods of doing things. Their patents were related to two specific things: a TV game device and a game which featured the coincidence of objects that was displayed on a standard television monitor. This is basically the game Ping Pong on the Odyssey, the basic technology behind the game, not the idea of the game itself. They couldn't say we have the rights to all ping pong games. It's what makes the things collide and bounce off of each other. This is by far the most famous game on the Odyssey. It's the only one that really has much play value. And the patents covered the basics of that gameplay on a CRT television. Everyone knows what a CRT is, right? Ah, whatever. But Magnavox had tried to negotiate with Atari and a bunch of these other companies, and after it just wasn't going anywhere, they decided they needed to get to a lawsuit. In April 1974, they filed it in Chicago because that's where a bunch of the companies that were making the arcade games were. And I actually went and scanned much of that court file once upon a time, back in the day when I had time to be able to do that. It came out during the discovery of this case that Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell had seen a demonstration of the Odyssey and its ping pong game, and it inspired him to come up with the idea of Pong, which he assigned to an engineer named Al Alcorn, who we're going to get back to in a moment. This wasn't specifically material in the case because, again, it's not about the idea, but it was harder to deny that they weren't aware of the patents, which would have at least given them a little legal leeway. And it didn't really help that Atari's home version of Pong came out and directly infringed on their other patent about the TV game device, and it dragged their retail partner Sears into it. Without Sears' help, Atari wouldn't have been able to launch their Pong system. By the time Home Pong was out, Atari was already working on a microprocessor-based multi-game system, not just playing games of Pong, but whatever programmers could come up with, because the not programmed. The research and development team called Cyan Engineering, with Steve Mayer on the top there and Ron Milner on the bottom there, were already doing a feasibility test on a microprocessor-based system. And this was pretty revolutionary because Atari was still mainly using multi-chip solutions for its arcade games, what we call transistor-transistor logic. So they were just moving to programming. Cyan also had come up with this revolutionary concept for what we now call the sprite to move objects around the screen. Not to get overly technical, but not every object in a game is a sprite. Mario is a sprite, the bush is not a sprite, if you want to use the very typical example. So Atari came up with the idea of a hardware-based sprite. After Cyan created the basic prototype for this console, they hired a chip designer there on the left named Jay Miner, who was just an absolute genius. He was the guy who was going to put together the graphics for this system. He was assisted by the guy on the right, Joe DeCure, and he named the project after his brand of bicycle, named Project Stella, after a brand of bicycles named Stella. In addition to the hardware expertise, Atari also needed software engineers because they basically didn't have that many. So they hired this guy named Larry Wagner to head the software arm of Project Stella. He and DeCure together made the first game, which you've probably played if you've ever played an Atari VCS, the classic tank dueling game Combat, pictured here. I actually talked to Wagner, and he shared with me a bunch of documents that help illuminate the timeline of this console, which is going to be important in a moment. But Project Stella was going to be expensive to bring to market, like tens of millions of dollars. Atari had some venture funding, but they were mainly kind of bootstrapped. So they wanted to sell out to another company. Unfortunately, that Magnavox lawsuit was an issue. It was still going on in 1976, and companies don't really want to see potential subsidiaries in the middle of legal spats. So even though Atari thought they might be able to win over Magnavox anyway, they came to the table to negotiate. In June 1976, Atari was ready to pay a license for the use of the Odyssey patents. They got away with a pretty sweet deal. They didn't need to pay a royalty installment. They paid a flat fee of $1.5 million. And just a few months later, Warner Communications came in and purchased Atari for $28 million. So all was good. They basically got away with highway robbery. At least that's the way Nolan Bushnell tells it. But was it? Within this contract, there was a specific clause that was added. It states to, read the legalese here. Atari agrees to provide Magnavox and Sanders with complete sets of detail video game products which Atari has manufactured and proposes to manufacture and or sell prior to June 1st, 1977. The technological assistance and know-how shall include but not be limited to the right of Magnavox and Sanders to use masks and plates involved with the licensed know-how of Atari. Now, according to Al Alcorn, again, he helped, he put together Pong. He's the creator of Pong and was the head of engineering at the time. This means that Magnavox basically had the rights to reproduce anything Atari released or showed to them up to that date, June 1st, 1977. And that persisted after they were bought by Warner Communications, specifically to finance the release of Project Stella. To Alcorn's telling, this meant they had to delay Stella, which he says was near done, until the next year's Consumer Electronics Show when they announced it, which was just after that June 1st date. So if they had announced it any time earlier, they would have given away their system. He also says that Magnavox representatives did visit Atari to view their they were working on, and they decided to play a little bit of subterfuge. They assigned Stephen Bristow, who was under Alcorn in engineering, to guide the Magnavox lawyers around. And according to Alcorn, Bristow didn't even know that this console existed, so he gave them the runaround without even knowing what he was doing. Deception! So, is this masterful story of subterfuge the heist of the century? Did Atari steal away Magnavox's chance to own the video game market with the VCS? No. Yes. Maybe. As with so many things, the answer is never quite so simple. I thought it was simple when I was first putting together this talk, but then I went back and looked at the sources. So we're gonna work backwards through those claims that I just said and get to the heart of this story. So as to Stephen Bristow's alleged ignorance of Project Stella, he was mostly involved in coin-op stuff. Most of the stuff that he was looking at was stuff that was going out into the arcade, but he wasn't completely out of the loop. He actually oversaw Cyan Engineering, where the console was first being prototyped. So he couldn't claim ignorance. He couldn't have said, oh no, we're not working on a programmable home console. He knew. What about this thing about announcements? That they couldn't announce it before the June CES? Well, this is a little bit, this is pretty much straight untrue. The contract doesn't say anything about announcement. When Atari announced the VCS is completely immaterial to what's in the language of the contract. Now, there is a condition about manufacturing in there, and we're going to get back to that. What about the idea that it could have been released in 1976? I also asked Larry Wagner directly about this. If you recall, he made the first game for the system, Combat, which they did very early on in the project, a little past mid 1976. But that was basically the only game they had. He only hired his first programmer in August 1976. By the end of production, they plan to have 9 game cartridges available at the launch of the system. Have a good solid library to launch, which is something that a lot of other game consoles throughout the years haven't quite figured out. And even the console's development manual wasn't even done by January 1977. They didn't have enough games to launch it in 1976. It just couldn't have happened. But let's get back to this legal clause. This is a little harder to parse. You have to be a little technical and legal. I asked a friend of mine, Carl Kuras of the video game newsroom Time Machine, who is a former lawyer, to look at the contract. And incidentally, this is the technicality on which I can call myself a video game history podcaster, because I appear on a regular segment of the video game newsroom Time Machine, even though it's not my show. And of course, highly recommended. Shout out to Carl here. Carl told me that the contract is when Atari planned to manufacture the technology. Magnavox did indeed basically have the right to copy anything Atari intended to manufacture before June 1st, 1977. And they only started manufacturing the VCS in July 1977. But if there had been any indication that Magnavox picked up that they were planning to manufacture before June 1st, they could have opened that door for them. That seems like a perfectly good excuse to try and give Magnavox the runaround, to pretend that this console didn't exist. But did Atari actually do that? Magnavox's lawyer at the time was asked about this in a future case where they sued Activision. Long story, we're not going to get into it. He says that they were considering exploiting their access to Atari's technology. And one of the things specifically identified in the contract is basically the technology behind the VCS. You can notice on here the little combat tanks. That's basically the fundamental technology behind this console. But the lawyer also said that they had some initial difficulty getting information out of Atari, that they were obligated to do so. So, what is the subterfuge behind all this? This idea that Atari could have had their console taken away from them. Atari definitely could not have hid the fact that their console existed. Beyond reasonable doubt, Magnavox knew that this technology was on the table. They may have hidden how complete it was in order to run out the clock until they were past June 1st, 1977. Even then, Magnavox still technically could have made a push that they could make a clone of the VCS. They had the rights to the patent, and they could have said that this was being obscured technology, but they never did. Instead, they made their own console, the Odyssey 2, which is another whole story we're not getting into. So, what have we learned about all this? Atari could not have launched the video computer system in 1976. The people who needed to know about the existence of the console, both inside and outside the company, definitely knew about it. Both people in Atari, like Stephen Bristow, and at Magnavox, like the lawyers. When they chose to announce the console wasn't important. It's when they manufactured it that mattered. And Magnavox probably did have a case where they could say, we're going to use your technology, if Atari was hiding what they were doing. They probably didn't, just because it didn't really seem like a viable business strategy at the time. Much later, there would be people making clones of the Atari system, but nobody knew it was going to be as huge as it was. It didn't really take off until 1980. I fully believe that Alcorn may have believed he had to be secretive, but it may have been more self-justified than necessary. So maybe they did a couple of things, but it didn't really matter to the final result. To wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about how we look at Atari nowadays, especially the video computer system. A lot of people kind of look at the VCS as a speed bump on the way to the Nintendo Entertainment System. You know, there's Pong, blah, 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 the Nintendo. You know, this early period isn't given a whole lot of interest by people who are in the broader spectrum. The Atari VCS is seen as something so incredibly primitive, it's hardly even worth considering as a video game. It looks so ugly, but the technology has an amazing legacy. Just look at the console's life. This is Home Run from 1978. Yeah, it's not good. When Mattel came in, they even of how bad Atari games looked. But then if you look at it at the This is Hero by Activision. This is the versatility that the hardware designers built into the console. And that core hardware team, Jay Miner and Joe DeCure, they helped create the Atari 8-bit computer line, the Atari 400 and 800, and later the Commodore Amiga. If there was a technology that was worth Magnavox's attention, they probably should have taken this. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation about the Atari video computer system, legal battles, and all that stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and we'll answer them.
Alrighty, give it up for Ethan. I hear the thunderous applause in the background. You did a
Mhm.
fantastic job. They're shouting your name. Um, so you did get a question. This first question is from an anonymous person. Um, what is a CRT television?
Okay, yes. For the youngins out there. So once upon a time, televisions, flat panel is what we have today. Nobody has anything that is not an LCD or a plasma screen or an LED television. A CRT television was made on a cathode ray tube, which had this bulb in front. And the way it drew stuff to the screen was based on the lines. And the video computer system really took advantage of this in several different ways. But that was the old style of television. Tube TVs might be the way that we look at it nowadays. It's a thing, if you go on Craigslist, you can find a whole bunch of people trying to offload their tube TVs. That's a CRT television.
Awesome. That was actually me who asked.
I know. I know, Roberto.
Okay, and then from Sarah, I do have to ask, I know what a sprite is, but what does it mean that this was implemented physically? Maybe too technical, but curious.
Okay, so a sprite is a thing in video in graphics in which you are able to bypass the drawing of everything else. So the sprite is able to move around the screen at will. It can go anywhere on the screen without disturbing what's in the background. A general way that you would do graphics is that every time a frame needs to come up, I think frames are still something that people movie shot at 24 frames. Most monitors are 60 hertz, which is 60 frames a second. They would do the entire screen all at once. So you would have to, if a pixel moved, you would have to redraw the entire screen. But if you have a character that's a sprite, you can move it anywhere on the screen and the background doesn't need to change. That's a simplistic way of trying to put it. But the sprite technology, it was built like there's a specific piece of hardware that would allow you to bypass the bitmap, is what that's called.
Okay. And then just to make it so essentially if we were like using something like paint, the sprite would be the thing we're putting in the foreground while we have something in the background to like help us move things around without disturbing the back, right?
Yeah, you can layer sprites in different ways. You could conceivably get a sprite behind the background, like on some Nintendo games, they would be able to
Hmm.
jump out of the background. But for the most part, you would only use these because you only had a limited number of them. On the Atari VCS, you only had five, and those were very limited in and of themselves. I won't go into that much detail on this,
Okay.
but the on the NES, you only had like 16 or something like that. So you would use them strategically. You would use them for the stuff that's moving a whole lot, like bullets or characters.
Got it. And then David White asks, why do you think companies launch consoles without a robust library of games?
Well, nowadays they can get away with saying that, oh, we've got backwards compatibility. So it's, for the first year, we can just kind of hold off on, providing something that you really want to play. I think it's in part because game development is hard, and when they definitely schedule to have more stuff on their systems, even back then, not even just talking the modern stuff. Like when the Sega Saturn launched in 1995 in the US, they were supposed to have like 8 games ready, but then they moved the launch back, so none of those games were ready. So they had 2 games that they were able to sell. And the Nintendo
Hmm.
64 was very similar. They didn't get their final specs on what the game was able to produce. So there was only 1 game available when it launched in the US, Mario 64.
Hmm. And then I have a question for you that
Mhm.
isn't about what is a CRTV. So outside of the Atari system, what do you think is the most influential gaming console that's been out there in video game history?
Well, it depends on the way you're looking at this, because if you're looking at nowadays, it has to be something that enabled internet play, because otherwise you're fooling yourself, because the
Hmm.
online component of modern games is the linchpin. It's what allows the continued expansion of games. So in that sense, the Xbox 360 is probably the most influential console on the infrastructure of modern games. Can you believe that thing's 20 years old now?
Oh my gosh. You're getting some complaints from people saying Ben saying Dreamcast obviously, and
the
David's
dream I mean, there's some interesting stuff with the Dreamcast, like the nexus of Microsoft. People who like they picked up a bunch of Dreamcast titles, and they also got a lot of engineers from 3DO, which is another kind of obscure console. And eventually, like the people who did 3DO, they made the first Xbox, and then the people who did Web TV, which was an early version of something like TiVo, were the people who did the Xbox 360.
and then David White saying what? No love for the Coleco Telstar?
The Coleco Telstar. Yeah, I mean that was just a Pong console, but there's the ColecoVision, of course. I actually have an article that I'll be putting up on Gaming Alexandria about the ColecoVision sometime in the future. Yeah, the Pong consoles, I find them very interesting, but I know it's very hard to make a narrative out of those that will be interesting to other people.
Hmm. Any other questions before I keep asking random stuff, guys?
I'm
Ask
fine with
away.
that.
I mean, I am too. I like talking.
Oh, believe me, he does. Me,
Okay.
me, Ben, and Josh, we all get together and while they're playing Civ and just kind of talk about things. So if you're into this history podcast stuff, we do have a Discord that you can join.
Okay, and then what brought your attention to this heist of the century that Atari did?
Well, it was so as I showed in here, this is a quote from what is definitely the most widely available video game history book, The Ultimate
Hmm.
History of Video Games by Stephen Kent. You can still pick up this book today. It's in a whole bunch of libraries. There's even a newer version that came out, didn't change any of the content, but just a new printing because he had a volume 2 that
Yeah.
came out. This book has lots of problems. I did a whole blog post about this. So I am kind of into dissecting pretty much every claim that's in this book. And this particular claim seemed pretty ironclad for a bit, because once we got the contract and we looked at it, it's like, oh yeah, it does say something about something just before the CES. But then we looked at it more closely. The legal language is a layered thing. So I started looking at it, and then I started asking some people that I'd interviewed about it, which by the way, I get away with being able to interview people, which basically no one else in the whole conference is able to do. And I started piecing together, like, do these facts line up? Could the VCS been released earlier? What does the contract actually say? And then, so this is one of these classic history things. Interpretation matters. It's not just about, here's your solid facts. It's how do you reconcile these facts together? So even though this was a narrative that was in a very popular history book, I decided to look at it and be like, huh, what is the actual deal behind this? And plenty of respectable people still believe that this is true, and they have evidence to believe that it's true. And I don't have an article that to try and explain why it's not. So this is kind of a test case in this particular in this particular form to dispel some of that myth.
Alrighty. And then you have a question from Joe. What is the most underrated genre of 1980s gaming and why is it interactive fiction?
Ha. Oh, interactive fiction. Yes, the classic text adventures, as people know them. I prefer the term IF. Um, yeah, IF is extremely fascinating. There's a guy called Jason Dyer who does a look deep into interactive, well, all adventure games. So it's not just the ones without graphics. If you go to Bluerenga, .blog, he goes in depth on history and playing these experiences as they go. Interactive fiction was definitely the forefront of figuring out what you could do in terms of interaction in games until we were at the point where graphics and like how much you could fit into a game kind of merged together. Like probably up until like the PlayStation era, the distinction between what the most interactive games did and what the most graphically interesting games did.
Mhm. And then, just because I'm curious to know, and we
Yeah.
do have 10 minutes left of questions. Um, so what is the status of Atari and Magnavox today?
Magnavox no longer exists.
Okay.
They were bought up by another company. Um, there is a brand Magnavox that sometimes gets put on televisions because televisions at the time. Uh, American manufacturers making televisions. Can you believe it?
Gross.
Yeah, wasn't all from Korea. And that's a whole story in itself. I mean, the downfall of Magnavox is very much tied up in uh its video game stuff. Not that the video games made it fall under, but many of their decisions in video games are tied up with that.
Mhm.
Atari as the original company Atari does not exist anymore. There is a company that calls itself Atari, which bought up the brand through one of the most convoluted brand schemes you could ever possibly imagine. Believe me, it is absolutely insane. My friend Alex Smith, he has a podcast called They Create Worlds. He has an episode on the history of the Atari brand, and that's your best resource. Things have changed a little bit since he did that episode, not too much. Basically, it's owned by a French company now. Uh, and they for a while they were kind of a laughing stock, but they have done a couple things in recent years that have actually really like it's they've been fostering their legacy as well as other things. They own Digital Eclipse, which is a great company that's making interactive documentaries. So they are not Atari as they were back in the day, but they can still be something good. And I do also know somebody who works there, Tim Lapatino, who did the art of Atari, which was a book before he was part of the company. Uh, so that's kind of the status is on those. Magnavox was bought by Philips of the Netherlands, and Atari doesn't exist, but the brand exists.
Mhm. Alrighty. Any other riveting questions before we continue? I'll give you guys a minute. Um, oh, from Ben.
Uh-huh.
What was with all the Lincoln Bears in the 80s? And then he goes, beards.
Lincoln Beards.
Just like the
Oh
big
no,
thick
just like
beers.
his. Yeah, this is definitely an '80s photo rather than a '70s photo, though. I do have the '70s photo of him as well. I don't know if that counts as a Lincoln beard,
No,
but
he has a
there.
mustache, so I'm Lincoln beard.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, the I mean the facial hair of the '70s is great. Like Nolan Bushnell at one time wore like a very stereotypical upper mustache thing, and it's lovely.
Alrighty.
Anything else? Any video game history tidbit? I can elaborate on all sorts of craziness.
This is a question I've liked asking. Um, if you didn't pick this topic, what topic would you have picked otherwise?
Ooh, I was well, originally I thought I was only going to be doing the panel with Sean. So I was looking at that the thing about the Sage program. Um, I did have a list that I sent to my friend, so that's what I'm looking at right now to see what I was thinking because I just threw myself into this too hard, and then it's like don't want to think about anything else right now because it you know want to get it right.
While you're looking for
Um,
that, we did have a question from Sarah.
all right.
What documentation issues do you believe will emerge with video game history that affect how it's remembered in 100 years? Since you mentioned you have an opportunity to interview people, but once that's no longer possible, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, we do kind of just wait for corporate archive stuff to appear where it can. There's been some great work, especially on Atari, by these guys here. If you can see this poster in the background, unfortunately, this book will never come out. But
Oh, you're
Marty
still sharing your
Goldberg.
screen.
Oh well, up here. There's a poster on my wall. It's for the unreleased Atari Inc. Business's War, which would have been by the sadly passed Kurt Vendel and Marty Goldberg. They did a lot of work collecting a whole bunch of stuff from Atari. Kurt literally dug in dumpsters when Atari was going under to get paperwork that was being tossed out. So like that kind of stuff is like vital. You can also look in court cases. We have gotten a lot of interesting stuff from court cases, including some of this Magnavox stuff. And we've but yeah, I mean, accessibility is always going to be a problem. The Video Game History Foundation just recently launched their library, in which they have a bunch of magazines and things, where people can look at digital files of magazines to see how reporting was on video games back in the day. But really, it's not that much different from anything else. In terms of the games, we are off a little bit better than a whole lot of other stuff because it's ephemeral. It doesn't have to exist in a physical form. It's better when you have stuff that is physically related, but we're off better than the film people were. Uh, and answer the question from Roberto from earlier. The two other ones that I was considering was the story of Tetris, which recently got made into a movie, which is very bad. And going to, I'm actually going to answer something on that on Ask Historians soon, so I can just post that if people want to read that. And also the story behind why there's a Dune and Dune 2 in the 90s, which is a fun little tale of left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing.
Alrighty, awesome. So that puts us right at about time.
Hmm.
So thank you all so much for joining us here today. Thank you
And
for,
thanks to all the presenters, all the organizers, especially for putting this all together. Make sure to stay around for the very last talk with Wesley, which is going to be great. He's a guy who's very dedicated, and also huge thanks. I mentioned before the History Podcast Discord. Bree has been a fantastic community builder, and yeah, so thanks again for inviting me to Intelligent Speech, Ben, who's in the audience, and thank you, Roberto, for making this also quite fun.
of course, glad I could ask all the questions. So yes, as Ethan mentioned, feel free to join us for the final keynote speaker with Wesley. And then finally, we have an after party after that. So come chat if you want to talk more with Ethan about the riveting tales of video game history, because honestly, we don't know that much about it. So Ethan's a wealth of information. Feel free to do so. It'll be a fun time to just sit and chat and just kind of decompress after getting all this information in your head, because sometimes it's a lot of info and it's nice to just let it out.
All
Alrighty.
right. See you there.
See ya at the after party, guys.